Hi, we're going to talk about the final thing you have to do in the formal research summary. That is quotations. So in order to look at the expectations for that, let's go into our course and look at the rubric. So I'm in my dashboard and I'm going to click into my course and I'm going to go to modules, which is my table of contents. I'm going to scroll down to 2.3.1. That's my research summary. And then I'm going to click Assignment Prompt. And this takes me to the actual assignment and the rubric. So a couple of things I want to point out to you guys. If you've read the instructions, you will see that you need to stay as close to the text as possible, quoting the writer's exact words at times to tie both you and your readers to the original text itself. So direct quotations are going to be expected. Also, you can paraphrase, okay? If I come down to the actual rubric, I'll see that quotations are two of the areas in which I'm going to be judged. First is the integration of quotations, and this says that I've used enough quoted material to demonstrate that the summary is accurate to the source. The student paraphrases when appropriate and quotes lengthy passages when necessary and uses brief quotes otherwise. To get the most points, the quotes should be inserted into the summary following proper grammar and punctuation for quotations and smoothly integrating into the writer's or my text, my prose. The other way I'm going to be judged is by contextualizing the quoted material. And we contextualize quotes in two ways. One, we introduce the speaker, and two, we introduce the situation. So relevant quotes should be preceded by sentences or phrases that introduce the speaker and feature a variety of verbs of attribution. It should also include contextual information so that I understand how each quote, why it's being said, and why it appeared the way it did. If I look at the most points, when first mentioned authors are introduced using first and last names and relevant biographical information to show the reader why this person is relevant to the controversy or a recognizable stakeholder. And I give information about the context of the quoted material, where it was said and in response to whom. Finally, the writer explains what this quote demonstrates about the viewpoint of the argument being summarized. So let's look at what I've written so far. I've introduced my speaker up at the very top in the first paragraph. He's Dr. Yoram Unguru, an associate professor of oncology at Johns Hopkins Kimmel Cancer Center. And he tells readers that it's time to address the issue of drug shortages. So he's a doctor and he's a professor. So from my article, I say that he begins his argument by discussing the consequences of the patients with no access to needed drugs and expresses his surprise that this has failed to attract significant attention. Quote, "Surprisingly, this largely American problem has failed to garner more attention." So right here, I'm introducing the quote and then I'm saying the same exact thing in the quote. So a better way to do it would be to combine these two thoughts. What this quote offers that my text doesn't is that this is an American problem. So I'm going to pull out this phrase and I'm going to add it into what I wrote. So my new thing will say, Unguru begins his argument by discussing the consequences of the patients with no access to the needed drugs and expresses his surprise that this, quote, American problem has failed to attract significant attention. So now I've got part of his quote, the part that I feel like is most necessary. I need to attribute this though. He says that in paragraph 2. Okay, I don't need to say his last name because I've already said it in this sentence. We already know he's the one speaking. So let's look at my next. He says that while shortages have occurred for a while, lately they have become worse and are lasting for a longer time. He then lists the reasons for the drug shortages. Quote, "The reasons for the drug shortages are complex. Economies of scale, limited profit margins, quality failures, consolidation in the marketplace, and the lack of manufacturing redundancy, inadequate market competition due to drive down prices, regulatory considerations, and the federal government's inability to negotiate drug prices." Well, that's way too much information for a summary. So let's think about how I can pare that down. These are complex reasons. He then lists I'm just going to add that word right there, complex reasons for the drug shortages, including limited profit margins for the drug companies, the failure of the government to negotiate drug prices. Okay. He says all of that in paragraph 3. Okay, so I've got par and 3. Okay, but if we look at what I've done here, he says we've got the word says. What's another word I could use here? What's another verb that I could use here? He admits that while shortages have occurred for a while, he argues that while shortages have occurred for a while, all right, either of those will work fine, and I'm getting rid of that verb says. Okay, the last thing I have is, and the consequences of the shortages, quote, "force my colleagues and me to delay treatments, skip or reduce doses, and select a less effective and familiar alternatives. Shortages have also increased medication-related errors and inversely impact clinical trials, a critical component in improving outcomes." So then I'll say en gros, then discusses the consequences of the shortage, which, quote, "force my colleagues and me to delay treatments, skip or reduce doses, and select less effective and familiar alternatives." And I'm going to leave it there. I think the reader gets from this that en gros is saying the reasons why the shortages occur are many and they're complex, but the consequences are significant. All right. He also does that in paragraph 4. All right. So when I put all of this together, I have a good sense of what he's doing, how he's laying out his argument. He begins his argument, then he moves into the actual support for that argument, including the consequences of the decisions by the decisions of drug manufacturers not to manufacture these drugs. I have paraphrased, only pulling small parts of quotes that I think are significant. I've introduced him as the speaker before each one, so this looks a lot like what I want in my formal research summary. Okay, let me know if you have any questions.